Our Cabinet has approved publication of the 2023 Integrated Resource Plan for written public comments. However, Business Unity South Africa warns that lack of details in the draft legislation makes it difficult to assess the plan's credibility. For more of a discussion on this, I'm joined now by the Stellenbosch University's Chief Engineer, Monique Roux, and Head of Energy Secretariat at the South African National Energy Development Institute, Professor Sampson Mamphweli. Good to have you both, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight on In Focus. Prof. Mamphweli, let's begin with you. Others have called it deeply flawed. Others, as I am saying, say it is thin on the details. However, you have welcomed the IRP 2023. Are you welcoming the process of actually having reached a new IRP dispensation, or are you welcoming the document as it is right now?
Yeah, so we welcoming both as SANEDI, the publication of the document, because it kickstarts the discussions that we need to have as a nation in terms of mid-term to long-term power system planning. You recall, Tago, that the revision of the IRP comes from the President's Energy Action Plan. Part of the President's Energy Action Plan is to deal with the mid-term solutions as well as long-term solutions. Now, if you look at the way the IRP has been drafted, the revised IRP has been drafted, it's got two time horizons. The first time horizon is basically analyzing the current efforts and then looking at the details of what is happening now in terms of bringing in new generation capacity and a whole lot of other things. And then it then makes a determination to say, for us to have system adequacy, what is it that is required? And then it makes various conclusions on that. And one of the major issues around the revised IRP is basically the extension of the life of the coal fleet under the second horizon, the time horizon, which is between 2030 and 2050. Now, the principle overall is that we need to fix the current generation fleet, especially the coal fleet, for us to have security of supply, and then introduce new generation capacity and gradually decommission the coal fleet so that we don't necessarily affect the economy the way it has been affected as things stand. Other countries have done similar kind of exercises. You go to China, they have done the same. Other countries, when they are under distress in terms of the energy situation, such as Germany, they have refired their coal-fired power stations. The IRP calls for emission abatement technologies to be incorporated into the current coal fleet, as well as fixing it to operate at the particular energy availability factor, which is 75% and above, for us to have adequacy, and then we bring in new generation capacity. On the long-term side of things, it's looking at the decarbonization of the sector itself. It doesn't have details. That's very much correct. Just before now, I was busy writing a submission as part of the SANEDI team that will be going to the DMRE to say there are certain details that we would like to see in the IRP. The assumptions themselves that were used, it lacks details in terms of those, and those are some of the things that we'll be taking back to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. But in the main, we welcome the publication of the document, and we welcome the fact that many people are starting to talk to it. Like what the Minister of Electricity has said, we are encouraging the public to make written comments to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. Ourselves, we will be making that particular submission, and we will be going around the country assisting the department in terms of securing some of the inputs from the various role players around the country as well.
Right. Monique, your opening remarks in terms of those two areas, the system adequacy, but two, in terms of new generation. How do you see it as reflected in the IRP document?
Thank you, Tabo. I think from our side, we also welcome the publishing of the documents. I think there's been a lot of promises and delays in getting the documents out. So I think it is a step in the right direction that it has been published eventually. But I think, as you've said, and as the comments have come through, that the document is very thin on details and lack a lot of information that probably the private sector and citizens were looking forward in creating confidence that they've got a grip on the energy crisis and they've got a good plan going forward. And I think it probably lacks that. It lacks confidence. Knowing a good or putting forward a good roadmap of what can be expected and now the crisis can be tackled. So I think in terms of security of supply, the IRP itself admits that there will be unserved energy up to 2030 and quite a lot of it, assuming that the energy availability factor will remain around 50%. We know that there's a good chance that it could even go below 50%. Looking at the trend the last couple of years from 2018, we've seen a declining EAF, so we're hoping that it won't decline any further. And then also a very slow rollout of new energy that's getting grid connected. And then also very worryingly, the fact that they're not talking about any transmission upgrades, how that's going to happen, or how grid capacity is going to be made available to connect the promised projects.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the areas that are of concern that they've raised so far, Monique. The IRP seemingly bucking the global trend of investing more in renewable energy. They have seemingly cut by about 30%, for example, is it on solar, and 55% less on scale wind investment by 2030. Is that a concern for you?
So I wouldn't say that that's much of a concern. I think it's quite a surprise seeing that the IRP 2019 made provision for quite a lot of solar and wind to be added to the network. And those really were the low-hanging fruits, because those projects can be built and added to the grid quite quickly. So I think people were expecting that there would be more solar and wind in the IRP, because that can be built and connected to alleviate the crisis quite quickly. But I think in the long term, not relying on wind and solar as much is probably not a bad strategy for South Africa, because our network is quite weak and we need quite a lot of base load in terms of clean coal or nuclear technologies, as has been put forward in the IRP. So I don't think overall what they're proposing in the IRP is the problem. I think just the methodology that they've followed raises questions, and as Prof Mamphweli also said, the assumptions that they've made are completely missing. So it makes it difficult to properly scrutinize what they've done and to install confidence, as I said, in the private and the public sector as to the correct methodology that was followed or not.
Yeah. Prof, before the break, as I mentioned there, a move towards less investment in wind and solar. Others are saying, while surprisingly, the department planning to add more money in procuring coal, even though some banks have shown, at least in the last couple of years, pulling out of funding projects like the Thabametsi and the Khanyisa coal-fired power projects. What have we learned? Why would we be taking that particular decision? What assumptions are we making there?
Yeah, so if you go through the assumptions, even though they are not to the latter detail, the drop on the PV share and the wind share from 10% on the PV side to 6%, and from 15% on the wind side to 9%. The assumption there is that because government has opened up the space for people to produce electricity without generation licenses, the gap will then be covered by those particular projects that are coming from the side of business. And the IRP does mention the fact that there is about 10,000 megawatts that has been registered by NERSA because of government, removing the licensing requirements. There are also other initiatives, such as your small-scale embedded generation. Eskom has recorded that we've got about 4 gigawatts of small-scale embedded generation, which is basically your rooftop solar PV in homes and small businesses. So those are some of the initiatives that the IRP appreciates in terms of the generation capacity on the renewable energy side of things. And remember, when they run this model, they look at system adequacy, they also look at the network. In terms of the network, we don't have enough network to take renewable energy. Like Monique indicated, if we have to bring in a lot more renewables between now and 2030, we may lose what we call ancillary services and a lot of other services that we require from what we term base load. So that is the part of the thinking which I'm picking up from the IRP. But for someone who is from the business side of things, who does not necessarily understand this particular space, without those detailed assumptions, it will be difficult for them to understand the thinking around this particular IRP. Coming to the question of the coal share, I don't necessarily understand why government would go into procurement of new generation capacity on the coal side of things. I see they've increased the share from 43% to 45%. Maybe government will have to invest on their own. I don't know in terms of that. We're still going to engage the department in terms of the thinking around that, in terms of what is it that they want to do there. But the IRP does emphasize the fact that the current coal fleet needs to be fixed, and it needs to operate at above 75% energy availability factor for it to give us security of supply. And then we bring in the emission abatement technologies. And some of the coal fleet that was going to be decommissioned, by the way, it was coal fleet that was not going to have reached end of life at that particular point in time if it was to be decommissioned between now and 2030. So that coal fleet that could give us longevity is the one that the IRP is calling for life extension, basically. But in terms of new generation capacity, I don't want to lie, we're still going to engage the department in terms of the thinking around that, given the facts that you have alluded to.
Yeah. Monique, it seems if we look, for example, at the targets that we've set, climate targets that we've set for ourselves, and the money that we are going to pay in terms of fines for those set targets, and the investment that we want to make in procuring more coal, it seemingly doesn't make sense. It's not cost optimal. What do you think the assumption would be there?
Yes, I mean, it is a difficult question to answer in terms of what the thinking of government is and what really is the best way to address this, because South Africa needs to have set their own minimum emission standards, which they admit to in the IRP is going to be extremely difficult to adhere to, and they're going to have to go against their own targets that they've set, their own standards that they've put into law. And if they don't, we're probably going to see extremely high levels of load shedding. And the IRP talks about 16,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation that need to be switched off almost immediately. And then in the next 5 to 7 years, about 30,000 megawatts of power generation that would need to be shut down, which would mean that the whole grid would probably implode. So I can't see that would happen. So it's a very concerning that they're admitting to that, and concerning that they don't have a plan of how to address that, seeing that we've got certain goals, signatories to the Paris Agreement, for instance, that we need to adhere to. But in my opinion, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for government to meet those. I think also noteworthy is the fact that they are admitting now that they're probably not going to adhere to their coal decommissioning schedule that they previously published, that they're going to keep those coal fired power stations online for much longer. And I think it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise to people. I couldn't see how they would shut down those coal-fired power stations with load shedding, and then with increased load shedding levels staring the country in the face if they had to do that.
Could it be that, I suppose, it's a consideration, as Prof was saying earlier on, of the job losses, around 25,000 by 2030 across the economy, that could have probably weighed in a little bit more than getting rid of those coal-fired power stations?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that's something that weighs quite heavily on their decision making, and that once again just points to the fact that we need to know what the assumptions are that has gone into this IRP, and without that it always leaves room to think or to question whether there are political motivations behind this, whether government is trying to keep the coal lobby happy. I'm not saying that it is, but I mean it would be nice if there are some or is some transparency so that those questions can be addressed, and so that we can know which factors government have weighed and which decisions they've made to point to the certain pathways that they put out in the IRP.
Yeah. Prof, the mention of load shedding up until 2027, Business Unity South Africa saying that's admitting failure even before you begin with your plan, almost defeats the purpose. It's something they're saying is quite unprecedented. How do you look at it?
Yeah, I look at it quite differently. So the IRP is a long-term plan, and it must point to us the reality in terms of medium-term to long-term planning. It must tell us that if the situation remains like the various scenarios that we painted in the IRP, load shedding will continue until 2027 and maybe beyond. However, we have a short-term plan which is contained in the President's Energy Action Plan. When I started, I indicated that the revision of the IRP was just part of the mid-term to long-term plan in terms of the President's Energy Action Plan. And that was necessitated by various factors, three factors actually. The electricity demand projections, the Eskom plant performance, as well as the new technology costs. Now, if you look at the Energy Action Plan, it's got various pillars. One of them is your demand response. That the government needs to start bringing on board. The other one is basically your Eskom generation recovery plan, which is also part of the Energy Action Plan. And all those are not necessarily part of the IRP. So there are plans that government needs to implement immediately to deal with load shedding immediately. And then there's the IRP that is telling us that in terms of long-term planning, if we don't implement certain measures, we will continue to have load shedding. If you look at towards the conclusion, the IRP does indicate various scenarios, and it does indicate that if certain measures are not taken into consideration, we will still have a shortage of generation capacity. But if we act like now on certain aspects, in terms of, for instance, your generation recovery, it touches also on the transmission grid plan, which the Minister of Electricity has presented to Cabinet. That is still need to be finalized, working with business and all that. Because you will recall that part of the problems is that we can't get new generation capacity in certain provinces, such as your Eastern Cape, Northern Cape and Western Cape, because the grid is constrained in those particular areas. So the grid transmission plan, which the Minister of Electricity is working on, becomes key as well. So if you look at all the government plans from the President's Energy Action Plan to the IRP in totality, you can't come to a conclusion that we will have load shedding until 2027. That is just a caution from the side of the IRP, in my view.
Yeah. So you believe between now and then, for example, the energy transmission company would have been able to resolve that issue in certain parts of the Cape around the constraint to the grid?
That depends on how solid the plan that the Minister of Electricity puts in place. He mentioned in the past things such as your build, operate, and transfer kind of models, where the private sector can come on board and build the transmission lines, operate them for a particular period, and then transfer them to the nation through Eskom. Those are some of the models that I expect will be in the transmission development plan that he is gonna present. On the side of the generation fleet, I am aware that the Eskom has got a generation recovery plan that goes down to unit level. They know what is the problem in various power stations, and they know how much it will cost to solve those problems. They know the timelines that they need to solve those particular problems. That's why some of us in the past called for the state of emergency on this particular matter so that it can unlock certain resources, because it boils down to resources. And I'm very much happy that now there is this memorandum of understanding between the two ministers, so that the Minister of Electricity can then be able to exercise authority and oversight on the Eskom board. That is the custodian of the Eskom generation plan. In the past, that's set with the Minister of Public Enterprises. And now, with the Minister of Electricity concentrating solely on ending load shedding and having that kind of authority to exercise over the Eskom board, maybe things will change. And if I were him, I would go back and look at that generation recovery plan and go back to National Treasury and the President and say, give me money, let me implement this generation recovery plan within the next 6 to 12 months so that we can deal with load shedding. I don't think that if there's money available and that particular plan is implemented alongside the various other measures, including the demand response, I don't think we can get even to 2025 with load shedding.
And Monique, I mean, when we look at some of the red flags that have been raised by Business Unity South Africa, we've touched on some of them, but some other experts have also raised concerns around the nuclear energy plan that is part of this IRP 2023. Previously, when we spoke of the nuclear project, we were looking at the cost and whether or not it will be affordable. Do you have any particular red flags that come up for you?
Yes, I mean, the popular opinion really worldwide to have is that you should go renewables and that you should connect and implement and build as much renewables as you can. But from the work and the research that we've done, it sort of becomes difficult to justify just going the renewable route. So we strongly looking at nuclear, and as Prof. Mamphweli also previously explained, if you go and you connect a large amounts of renewables to the South African grid, it becomes really difficult to keep our grid stable, and we need a certain amount of baseload power, and to do that in the greenest and the cleanest way possible, you would need to look at nuclear power. We've done extensive modeling looking at large amounts of renewables to the grid and to the network, and I can really, with the confidence, say that it becomes extremely difficult to manage your grid, and particularly the South African grid, if we only had a lot of renewables connected to the network. And then balancing the grid with the renewables become hugely expensive, because you need to have plants installed on your grid, a lot of battery storage connected to your grid, which really drives up your price. And then if you compare that to the price of nuclear, it really sort of begs the question as to whether nuclear isn't the cheaper option in the long term compared to what renewables would be with the added cost of getting them onto the grid.
Yeah. Prof, your thoughts on that? I mean, some experts are saying that the new plan to use nuclear would not ensure energy sovereignty, would do little to address the country's energy crisis within the next 10 years. They're saying you'll be faced with a number of challenges, including high-level nuclear waste, extended construction periods, and significant costs and time overruns.
Yeah, so I agree with Monique. I mean, the nuclear part of things, nuclear is clean energy source. Like I indicated before, the IRP is a long-term kind of a plan. It's not a short-term solution. The President's Energy Action Plan talks of the immediate plans, the mid-term plan, and the long-term plan. Going back to 2003 towards 2008, when the renewable energy, the white paper on renewable energy was published, it kind of gave some red flags in terms of generation capacity, to say we will run out of generation capacity. And then in response to that, government started with the new build program. And we know that it did not go the way it should have gone with the building of Kusile and Medupi power plants. That was in response to the red flags that were in the renewable energy white paper. Now, we're now sitting with a draft IRP that is also giving red flags. Now, the least that government could do is basically to plan in terms of long term, so that 10 years, 11 years towards 15 years from now, we shouldn't be talking about shortage of generation capacity and the threat to the economy. Like what Monique indicated, if we were to decommission the 16 megawatts now, that is not adhering to the emission standards, and the 30-something thousand megawatts later, basically the entire system collapse. And if you look at the two time horizons that are contained in the draft IRP, the second time horizon, that is 2030 to 2050, is dealing with that particular aspect to say in the long term we shouldn't be sitting here talking about shortage of generation capacity, and nuclear in this particular case is the plan for the future. It's not going to solve our load shedding crisis today. What will solve the load shedding crisis today is the president is part of the energy action plan. Some of the things that I've alluded to, including the generation recovery plan, as well as the bringing in new generation capacity in line with the provisions of the IRP. I expect that at the end of the day, when the IRP has gone through the public participation process and NEDLEC, the department will publish the detailed assumptions, and then people can also interact with those. Some of us are still going to engage the department to say publish the assumptions now for the public to be able to engage with them, because we really need some level of transparency, and we also need to be able to interact with this particular document from an informed point of view. And part of the submissions that some of us are writing is calling for that, and also going into the details of some of the gray areas where we feel that certain technologies could have been included, and government could start to invest in those particular technologies going forward as well.
I appreciate you both. Thank you very much for coming on and your interventions tonight. Monique Roux, Chief Engineer, Stellenbosch University, and Professor Sampson Mamphweli, Head of Energy Secretariat, South African National Energy Development Institute. We appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming on.